The year was 1884, and the town of Deadwood Canyon lay cracked and dusty at the lip of a red gorge where the desert wind whistled like a lonesome fiddle. The streets were dirt and splinters, lined with leaning storefronts, half-swinging shutters, and the sour smell of horses baking under the afternoon sun. Heat shimmered across the rooftops, and the voices of card players spilled from the saloon, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clink of glasses. Into that noise and glare rode a man whose presence quieted the air around him. His name was Elias Crow. He sat tall in the saddle, the brim of his hat casting shadows over a face weathered by years on the trail. His coat was worn thin at the shoulders, his boots carried the dust of miles behind him, and beside his stirrup trotted a creature that made the crowd stiffen where they stood. The dog was a beast few would claim willingly. Black as coal, hide marked with old scars, one ear tore down the middle, and one eye cloudy from some long-ago wound. His gait was lopsided, but his growl was low and steady, a promise rather than a threat. Folks called such animals cattle killers, cursed hounds that brought ruin wherever they went. Mothers pulled their children close, ranch hands spat into the dirt, and whispers rose sharp as cactus needles. "That there's the devil's dog," someone muttered from the boardwalk. Elias gave no sign he heard. He guided his horse slow through the heart of town, reins loose in his hands, his gaze cutting left and right like a man taking measure of every doorway and shadow. The dog, Ash, though no one yet dared call him by name, kept close to the horse's flank, lips peeled just enough to show teeth when a drunkard stepped too near. By the time Elias reined up outside the saloon, the porch had filled with men who carried themselves with the easy arrogance of those unchallenged too long. They were the Vance brothers, four in all, known from the canyons to the ranchlands as thieves, rustlers, and killers in the sheriff's blind eye. Their spurs jangled as they leaned against the posts, grins wide and cruel. "Well, if it ain't a sight uglier than sin," drawled Caleb Vance, the eldest, flicking a match against his boot heel and lighting a cigarette. He pointed the flame toward Ash. "Look at that beast. Carries scars same as his master." The men laughed, a chorus of jeers that rolled out across the street. Elias swung down from the saddle with deliberate calm, boots sinking in the dust. He didn't raise his head, didn't spit back words, just tied his reins and gave the dog a quiet pat on the shoulder. Ash sat, shoulders tense, one good eye fixed on the outlaws like he knew their measure already. "What kind of fool drags a cattle killer into town?" sneered Luke Vance, the youngest, his hand hovering near the pistol at his side. "Only thing worse than keeping a cur like that is trustin' it not to chew your throat out while you sleep." Elias's voice came quiet, a rasp like gravel sliding in the canyon wind. "A man's fool enough only when he listens to the wrong mouths." Then he turned his back on them and tied Ash to the hitch rail. The dog bristled but stilled with a single word. The brothers chuckled louder, unsettled but unwilling to show it. "He's crazy," one of them muttered, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Crazy or cursed." Elias walked through the saloon doors without a backward glance, boots striking wood slow, steady, like a drumbeat calling men to war. Behind him, the outlaw smirked at the townsfolk, as if daring anyone to share in the joke. None did. The silence that lingered was heavy, filled with unease that no whiskey could wash away. Inside the saloon, air thick with smoke and sweat, Elias crossed to the counter. The barkeep froze mid-polish, eyes flicking toward the window where Ash waited like a black sentinel. "Don't want trouble," the men muttered. Elias placed a coin on the counter. "Then don't make any." The piano faltered in the corner. The gamblers' laughter died down. Men who moments before had shouted over their hands of cards now sipped in silence, sneaking glances at the stranger who'd walked in with a cursed dog and ignored the worst man in the county. The Vance brothers followed, spurs jangling as they pushed through the doors, the swing of the batwing slapping against the frames. Their laughter filled the space again, harsh and forced. They spread wide, blocking exits, their eyes locked on Elias as he leaned at the bar, one hand resting near nothing more dangerous than his glass. Caleb flicked ash from his cigarette onto the floorboards. "You got nerve, Crow. Walking in here with that beast like you're king of the canyon." Elias took a long drink, set his glass down with quiet finality, and spoke without turning. "Some men need a pack behind him to sound loud. Some of us don't." The words fell sharp as steel scraping free of its sheath. Murmurs stirred among the townsfolk who listened, the kind of murmurs that could grow into legend given time and retelling. The outlaws shifted, anger tightening their mouths. Luke Vance spat into the sawdust. "You best keep the dog outside where it belongs, stranger. Next time I see it sniffing around, I'll put a bullet between its eyes." Ash growled low from beyond the wall, sound carrying through the open doorway like thunder rolling over the canyon rim. Elias finally turned, his gaze hard, voice steady. "Try it. See if your hand's faster than his teeth." The saloon held its breath. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Caleb smirked and broke the tension with a bark of laughter. "Let him be, boys. Ain't worth wasting bullets on a mad drifter." He jabbed a finger at Elias. "But mark my words, one day the hound'll turn on you, and I'll be here to watch it." The brothers swaggered off to their table, cards slapping down once more, but the air never lightened. Every man knew the word spoken that day carried weight, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Elias finished his drink, collected his change, and stepped back into the blinding sunlight. He untied Ash, crouched for a moment to meet the dog's single eye. The townsfolk still stared, whispering about curses and death, but Elias seemed to hear only the steady pant of the animal beside him. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "We've walked through worse fires." And so he moved down the street, the dog padding at his heel, their shadow stretching long and dark across the dirt. Behind them, talk swelled, the story already growing in the mouths of men who would carry it to the next town, the next saloon, the next firelit night. They said Elias Crow was touched with madness for keeping a hound born of hate. They mocked him for it, laughed loud and sharp. But the storyteller's voice, the one that always rises when dust meets blood, whispered of a day not far off when men would choke on that laughter and learn why Elias Crow never missed a shot. And Deadwood Canyon, scorched and rattling with cicadas, waited for that day like dry brush waits for the strike of a single spark. Evenings in Deadwood Canyon carried a different kind of silence, the sort that pressed against the ribs and left men listening to their own hearts. The sun dipped low and painted the cliffs in fire, and the saloon windows glowed amber as the townsfolk nursed whiskey and let whispers slip into the smoky air. It was during such hours that talk about Elias Crow began to grow, spoken in cautious tones by men who claimed to know fragments of his story. One ranch hand swore Elias had once worn Union blue, a sharpshooter who could drop a Confederate officer from half a mile away without blinking. Another gambler, who claimed to have seen him years earlier near Abilene, insisted Elias had been a bounty hunter, the kind who never brought a man in breathing if he didn't have to. A woman, bent with age and sharper than her knitting needles, muttered that no man carried eyes like his unless he'd buried too many souls to count. They all had pieces, guesses carved into legend, but no one carried the whole. Elias never confirmed nor denied a word. He was a drifter, plain and simple, yet he carried himself with the weight of a man who had once belonged to something greater. The silence around him was not emptiness but discipline, a shield that gave nothing away. Those who watched him long enough understood that his hands, broad, calloused, and steady, were meant for work but crafted for killing if need be. He bore scars on his jaw and across his knuckles that spoke louder than any tale the town could conjure. If Elias's past was the stuff of speculation, the dog story was a wound the town remembered well. Ash had once prowled the campfires of the Vance brothers. They'd stolen him as a pup, raising him on cruelty and blood. Tied to posts, forced into fights with other dogs, starved until he tore into flesh just to survive, he'd been nothing more than a toy for their violence. Men remembered hearing his howls from the canyon when they tested his strength against wolves caught in traps. But cruelty breeds defiance, and one night the dog had turned. He'd lunged at his keepers, tore Caleb Vance's hand deep enough to scar, and in their rage the brothers beat him nearly to death, leaving him in the desert for vultures to claim. Most figured the beast had perished. Yet months later he returned, trailing behind Elias Crow, ribs sharp through his skin, one eye clouded, scars raw across his hide. Folks spat when they saw the hound walk into town beside the stranger, muttering curses about bad omens and cursed shadows. Men shook their heads at Elias, baffled that any soul would claim a creature bred from torment. But Elias fed him, watered him, and laid his coat across him on cold nights. The dog never left his side again. They were mirrors, those two, scarred survivors the world had cast aside, yet neither broken nor begging for pity. Both carried reputations heavy enough to crush weaker men. Elias wore his with the indifference of one who no longer cared what weight he bore. Ash wore his like a shield of teeth, snarling at those who dared step too close. Together, they formed a quiet partnership that unsettled anyone with sense enough to notice. Children, braver than their parents, whispered about the bond when they thought no one listened. They said the cowboy talked to his dog in words too low for others to hear, and the dog seemed to answer with a flick of an ear or a growl from deep in his chest. Some claimed Elias didn't need to aim because Ash guided him, signaling danger before it ever appeared. Others laughed it off as nonsense, but the laughter always died too quick, nervous and thin. While the town speculated and watched, trouble thickened like storm clouds. The Vance brothers grew bolder with each passing week. They rustled cattle in broad daylight, cut fences, set barns aflame, and shot any rancher fool enough to protest. One family was found dead by their own water trough, their cattle driven off into the canyon. Another widow swore the brothers demanded half her herd as payment for protection. She paid, because her children's lives were worth more than pride. The sheriff drank his authority away in the saloon corner, his badge tarnished and his eyes dulled by fear. He'd once stood tall, but years of watching the brothers kill unchecked had hollowed him out until he was little more than a mint-shaped shadow. When asked why he didn't arrest them, he muttered about needing evidence, about the danger of crossing men with more guns than the law could summon. Nobody believed him. Nobody challenged the brothers either. Not openly. Elias listened. He sat at the saloon's back table most nights, ash curled at his boots, and heard every whispered complaint, every broken voice confessing another cruelty laid at the outlaw's feet. He never spoke, never offered comfort, never made a promise. But his eyes, cold and steady, followed the words as though weighing them on invisible scales. Some men mistook his silence for cowardice. They called him a fool who kept a crippled dog instead of a gun at the ready. But others, those who knew the hard edge of survival, saw something else. They recognized the patience of a hunter who waits, watching, learning, before striking in a way that leaves nothing standing. It was the widow who spoke loudest one evening, her voice trembling but fierce. Her husband had been gunned down 2 months past, his body left on the trail as warning. She stood in the saloon doorway, her shawl wrapped tight, her children waiting outside. "Somebody has to stop them," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "If no man here will do it, then the town's already dead." The sheriff lowered his gaze, ashamed. The gamblers shuffled their cards in silence. The ranchers drank deeper from their glasses. But Elias Crow lifted his eyes at last, and though he said nothing, the widow caught his gaze and stilled. In that silence, she seemed to hear a promise unspoken. Outside, Ash rose to his feet, hackles bristling as the Vance brothers rode by, drunk laughter rattling against the canyon walls. Dust billowed in their wake, blotting out the sunset, and the town shivered under the shadow they left behind. By then, whispers of Elias and his dog had spread far beyond Deadwood Canyon. Men from neighboring towns came through with stories of a scarred drifter and his beast, of eyes that saw too much and hands that never shook. And always the question lingered, why keep the hated hound? Why claim the devil's dog as kin? The answer lay coiled in a bond between them, a bond forged from scars, silence, and survival. What no one yet realized was that the town's salvation, or its ruin, hung on that very bond. And when the time came, Elias Crow would draw his iron not for pride, not for gold, but for justice measured by the growl of a dog who had once been left for dead. The Vance brothers came thundering into Deadwood Canyon one blistering afternoon, the kind of day when the sun burned high and mean and the air shimmered with heat. Their horses kicked up a storm of dust as they rode down the main street, revolvers hanging loose from their fists, bottles clutched in their other hands. Laughter, loud and raw, cut through the usual hum of town life, silencing gamblers and shopkeepers alike. They didn't come quiet, nor did they come for drink. They came to remind the people who owned the ground beneath their boots. "Gather up," Caleb Vance shouted, his voice rough with whiskey. "Ranchers, farmers, shop rats, all of you. Time to pay for the privilege of breathing our air." He swung his revolver at the crowd, grinning wide when mothers pulled their children close. The brothers dismounted in the middle of the street, spurs jangling as they swaggered. Luke Vance fired a shot skyward, the sound cracking against the canyon walls and echoing back like a scream. "We'll be collecting beef, coin, or both. Sheriff won't stop us, you know it. Best you pay up before sundown, or we'll take what's owed." Eyes dropped. Hands fumbled for wallets, for promises of cattle. No one dared argue, not after what had happened to the last men who stood against them. But then Ash appeared, padding steady alongside Elias Crow, who leaned against the hitch rail outside the saloon. The dog's single eye gleamed in the light, his snarl low enough to crawl into the bones of every man listening. Elias didn't speak, didn't move much at all, just rested a boot on the rail and let his gaze linger on the brothers. The outlaws turned, laughter souring when they saw him. Caleb spat into the dirt. "There's the fool with the devil's mutt." He jabbed his cigarette toward Ash. That beast ever wanders near our camp, I'll put him down like the rabbit cur he is." Luke grinned wicked. "Hell, I'll shoot it now. Save the trouble." His hand twitched toward his holster. The street froze. A murmur rose among the crowd, sharp as dry grass catching fire. But Elias only shifted the brim of his hat against the glare of the sun. His silence was steady, unnerving, the kind that made men hear their own threats echo back at them. Ash stood unmoving, hackles bristling, growl a steady rumble like distant thunder. Something in that calm gnawed at the brothers. Caleb's grin faltered, just for a breath. He covered it with a bark of laughter, holstering his gun. "Mad as a mule, ain't he? Keep your freak on a leash, Crow. You'll find we shoot straighter than you think." Elias said nothing. He turned, tapped the dog's shoulder once, and walked back toward the edge of town. The brothers shouted insults after him, but the words bounced off him like pebbles on stone. The crowd watched him leave, some shaking their heads, others whispering questions they dared not voice. Why didn't he fight? Was he afraid? Or was he waiting for something? Whispers became habit in the following days. Elias rose before the sun and walked out past the livery to the open field, rifle slung across his back, Ash patting at his heel. He'd set bottles on fence posts, cans on rocks, then step back so far the targets blurred against the dawn. Each shot cracked clean, sharp as a whip, and every target shattered without mercy. The townsfolk who passed on their way to chores began to notice. The man never missed. Not once. By noon, he'd vanish, leaving only shards of glass glittering in the dust and townsfolk murmuring that maybe the curse wasn't the dog, but the men who threatened him. Yet fear still ruled. Each rancher who handed over coin or cattle did so with shoulders bent, voices lowered, as if waiting for the storm to break. They began to look toward Elias with something between hope and dread. He was no lawman, no savior, but he was the only man who stared down the Vance brothers without trembling. One evening, as shadows stretched long across the canyon, the widow found him sitting by the trough behind the saloon, polishing his rifle in the fading light. Her shawl clung to her shoulders against the chill, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. She stepped closer, hands clenched in desperation. "They killed him, Elias," she whispered, voice raw. "Shot him down like an animal, left him in the dirt. My children won't sleep for fear they'll be next. You've seen what they are. You heard what they've done. Please." Ash lifted his head, one good eye catching hers, and she shivered beneath that gaze. Elias set the rifle across his lap, running the cloth down its barrel until it gleamed silver in the twilight. His silence stretched long, heavy enough to break her heart. She thought for a moment he would dismiss her as all others had. Then he looked up. His eyes were iron, fixed and unyielding. He spoke only 4 words, but they sank into her bones like gospel. "It ends with me." The widow trembled, tears spilling, not from grief this time but from something fiercer, hope. She bowed her head, whispered her thanks, and walked away with shoulders straighter than when she had come. Elias watched her go, then turned to Ash. The dog wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate, as though understanding the weight of what had been decided. Nights grew tighter, the town bending under fear like a brittle fence in a storm. The Vance brothers roamed louder, drunker, bolder, demanding more with every passing day. Still, Elias held his silence, moving through the town with calm that unsettled even the bravest. It was not the calm of surrender, nor the stillness of fear. It was something else, something older, like the patience of stone watching water carve the canyon. Men tried to read him, to guess when he would draw. But Elias Crow carried no pride that needed defending, no fear that drove his hand to twitch. He had walked through wars, through loss, through enough blood to know the difference between noise and necessity. And so the narrator's voice, the one that lives in the dust and wind of the frontier, whispered to those who would one day tell this story. Some men draw quick out of pride. Others, out of fear. Elias Crow, he drew only when it mattered. The night the storm finally broke began with blood on the dirt. The Vance brothers had ridden out past the canyon rim to a ranch no more than 3 miles from town, their laughter carrying across the land like a death knell. They cut fences, set fire to hay, and drove cattle into the night until the ground thundered beneath their hooves. When a boy, barely 14, skinny arms clutching a shotgun too heavy for him, ran out screaming for them to stop, Caleb Vance turned in the saddle and shot him down without pause. The sound was sharp and final, leaving only the cries of his mother echoing in the smoke. By dawn, word had spread like wildfire. Deadwood Canyon reeled beneath it, grief and terror binding every man, woman, and child in silence. That morning, Elias Crow stood at the saloon's edge with Ash at his heel, eyes narrowed against the wind. The town gathered, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak. The sheriff cowered at his office, too drunk or too broken to emerge. Finally, Elias's voice cut through the murmurs, low and certain. "It ends tonight." The words dropped heavy as lead, and though he said no more, they carried across the street, through the hearts of the townsfolk, and into the marrow of history. By the time the silver moon rose over the canyon, Elias Crow was walking into the wolves' den. The canyon walls glowed pale under the night sky, jagged shadows stretching long as if the land itself held its breath. Fires flickered in the outlaws' camp, drunken songs slurred around bottles, horses tied loose to mesquite trees. Ash trotted ahead, no more than a shadow sliding between rocks, his growl muffled by the wind. Elias moved steady, rifle slung, revolver loose at his side, boots striking dirt with a rhythm that promised reckoning. The first outlaw saw him emerge from the dark, and his laughter rang out, sharp and cruel. "Look who's come to die. The fool and his cure." Others joined in, drunken cackles rolling like thunder. They raised bottles, jeering, some spitting into the flames as if to curse him. Elias said nothing. He stood at the edge of the firelight, head brim low, face carved in shadow. Ash circled, weaving between wagons and barrels, his presence little more than a whisper in the dark. The men mocked, shouted promises of how they'd skin the dog, hang his carcass from a tree, then put Crow beside him. Then Ash moved. A low growl hummed from the dark, pulling one outlaw's gaze rightward. Another cursed, turning left when he saw the gleam of teeth. In the confusion, Elias drew. The first shot cracked, echoing against the canyon wall, and a man fell forward into the fire, smoke rising from the hole in his chest. Panic flared. Bottles shattered, chairs overturned, hands scrambled for pistols. Ash darted through the camp, growling low, snapping wood, scattering shadows. Each time the dog shifted, Elias fired. One shot, one man down. The camp rang with gunfire, but none of it struck true. His aim was unerring, every bullet a verdict, every pull of the trigger another outlaw silenced. It was then the brothers began to understand. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. Elias wasn't just shooting into the dark. He was reading the dog. A growl meant danger left. A snarl meant a man hidden low. A sudden silence meant death waiting in stillness. Together, they moved like one creature, man and hound bound by scars and trust forged in fire. The outlaws tried to regroup, shouting orders, but chaos ate them alive. Elias moved with precision, face unreadable, his revolver steady in his hand. Ash tore through the campfire's light, a black specter that unsettled even the hardest killers. One by one, they fell, their laughter silenced, their mockery paid in blood. By the time the flames burned low and the desert night grew still, only two figures remained upright, Caleb Vance, breathing heavy, rage etched into his scarred hand, and Elias Crow, standing calm in the glow of dying embers. The others lay scattered across the camp, shadow sprawled lifeless against the dust. Caleb spat blood into the dirt. "You think one dog makes you God?" His voice cracked, torn between fury and fear. "You're nothing but a broken drifter with a mutt." Elias holstered his revolver and stepped forward into the pale blue light of dawn breaking across the canyon rim. His words were quiet, but they carried like thunder. "This much sees clearer than any man I've met. He knew what you were before the town ever did." They stood facing each other as the sky shifted from black to violet. The hush of dawn wrapped around them, stretching every heartbeat into eternity. Caleb's hand hovered over his holster, twitching with impatience, pride burning his blood hotter than whiskey ever could. Elias stood loose, almost at ease, his fingers resting near the butt of his revolver, his gaze fixed with the stillness of stone. Time slowed. A crow called in the distance. Dust lifted from the canyon floor in a faint breeze. Caleb's eyes flickered, his hand jerked, and Elias fired. The gunshot cracked like the first note of a hymn, sharp and final. Caleb staggered, eyes wide in disbelief, clutching at the wound blooming across his chest. He fell backward into the dust, choking curses that faded into silence. The echo of the shot rolled through the canyon, long and haunting, until it faded into nothing but the morning wind. Elias lowered his revolver, smoke curling from the barrel. Ash padded forward, circling once around the fallen outlaw before sitting at Elias's side, chest heaving but eye steady. Together they stewed in the growing light, the dog and the men, shadows stretching long across the earth. The sun crested the canyon rim, gold spilling down the cliffs, and the camp lay silent but for the crackle of dying embers. Elias said nothing more. There was no need. The story was already written, carved into dust, blood, and the memory of all who had ever mocked him. When he turned to leave, Ash walked beside him, limping slightly but proud, tail wagging once as if sealing the bond between them. Behind them, the canyon held its silence, the Vance brothers gone, their reign ended by the men they'd laughed at and the dog they despised. By the time Elias and Ash crested the ridge and disappeared into the dawn, the tale had already begun to take root. Men would tell it by campfires, in saloons, across ranch fences and lonely roads. They'd say Elias Crow never missed, that his dog saw for him, that together they fought like shadows of the same soul. And the legend would grow, as all true legends do, until every corner of the frontier knew that the outlaw gang that once ruled Deadwood Canyon had been silenced by one scarred cowboy and the hated hound who never left his side. Morning broke soft and pale over Deadwood Canyon, the kind of dawn that washed the desert in silver before the sun bled gold across the cliffs. Smoke from the outlaws' campfires still lingered in the canyon below, thin and curling, carrying the acrid memory of gunpowder and death. The town woke slowly, doors creaking open, boots dragging across boardwalks, voices hushed as if the people feared to disturb the silence left behind. For the first time in years, there was no laughter of outlaws echoing in the streets, no gunshot cracking across the hills to remind them who ruled. The Vance brothers were gone, every last one of them. Their absence was louder than their presence had ever been. It filled the air like a hymn, a quiet so heavy it made grown men remove their hats and women hold their children closer, not in fear, but in awe. By the well outside the saloon, Elias Crow stood with Ash at his heel, the hound scarred hide glistening in the newborn light. He carried no smile, no boast, no mark of victory. His eyes were steady, the eyes of a man who had seen too much to take pride in killing, even when killing was justice. He tightened the strap on his rifle, slung his gear across the saddle, and gave a single low whistle. Ash trotted beside him, silent as always, the rhythm of his steps steady in the dirt. The widow stood in the doorway, her children clinging to her skirts. She said nothing at first, her lips trembling with a weight of gratitude words could not bear. When Elias mounted his horse, she finally whispered into the cool air, "Thank you." Her voice cracked, but it carried, soft and reverent. Elias did not look back, yet something in the slight turn of his head told her he had heard. She pressed her hand to her chest, tears tracing her cheeks as she watched him ride toward the horizon. The townsfolk gathered, men who once mocked him, women who once cursed the dog at his side. They stood with hats in hand, not daring to speak until the dust of his horse faded down the road. Where they had once seen a fool with a cursed beast, they now saw something larger than life, a man who had faced what none of them dared and walked away without flinching. And the dog they had spit at, the scarred hound they called the devil's curse, now trotted in their memory as a shadow of loyalty, the unbreakable bond that had guided every bullet, every step, every breath. Whispers rose like wind in the canyon. They would grow into stories, and those stories would grow into legend. Folks would say Elias Crow never missed a shot, but that wasn't the whole of it. The truth was simpler, sharper. He wasn't aiming alone. Ash had been his eyes, his warning, his measure of men. Together they had been something more than one man or one dog could ever be. They called him a fool for keeping the hated dog, the old storytellers would murmur years later by the fire. But when the smoke cleared, folks learned what Elias Crow already knew. A man's aim is truest when he ain't shooting alone. And so it ended, as all great tales do, not in thunder, but in dust. Elias rode out beneath the rising sun, the scarred hound loping faithfully at his side. Their figures shrank against the endless horizon, two shadows bound together, fading into the vast silence of the frontier. The dust they left behind drifted high, glinting gold in the early light, until it too was gone. But the legend remained, sealed forever in the whispers of the West.